Welcome to the Inspiro Podcast, the podcast exploring personal growth, leadership, strategy, communication, and fulfillment. We are your hosts, Jason Luchtefeld and Bill Woodburn. I'm here as a dentist, transitioning into a career to help facilitate individuals and their organizations towards a more fulfilling future.
Hi there, I'm Bill Woodburn, and I'm a licensed professional counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist in Austin, Texas. I'm fascinated by the way people come together to solve problems, whether that's couples or families, dental practices, or organizations. We're going to be exploring a lot of topics, and for us to be able to be free to do that, I have to let you know that this is not intended to be dental advice or counseling advice.
When something happens, when somebody is talking about their narrative, things happen. What I hear is, it happened for a reason. And then they go on. That makes my skin crawl because I don't think it happened for a reason. And I think that is a soothing cognitive tool that people are using to try to ease the discomfort of what happened, rather than realizing how difficult the reality can be if there isn't a reason attached to whatever the event was.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to agree, but I'm also going to add in our defense as human beings. What that's expressing isn't just la la land. That's expressing our need for an inclusive story. What that tells me when somebody says, oh, it probably happened for a reason. It's like, oh, you're struggling to fit this event into your narrative. Otherwise, you'd tell me what the reason was. When you affirm that it must be a reason, but I don't know what the reason is, it's like, oh, dude, this just torpedoed your narrative, and you have no place for this tragic event to have happened to you. It was not part of the plan. It was not part of the narrative, and you are really struggling. Now, I'm with you. That's not always a great place to head, but I see why people head there. And I know what they're really saying is this doesn't fit. Not only that, if I include it in my narrative, it breaks a whole bunch of other parts of the narrative. I will always be safe. I will always be cared for. No one will ever leave me. All these parts to this person's narrative literally just exploded and are lying in pieces on the ground, and they're looking at it going, well, I guess there must be a reason. I hope there's a reason. I can't remember what the reason would be right now because none of this fits.
Yeah, the reason is something that comes in the future that then helps to form a completion to fit the narrative.
Which is, we often talk about resolution to grief or whatever. One of the important pieces is we've now built a narrative that, includes things like that happening to us.
Okay, so are you saying that I need to be more gentle and respectful to people that use that phrase? Or are you telling me that I can say, it sounds like you need to work on your narrative?
Well, you can say it. You can do either one. I personally like to remind myself that they're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
That maybe there's some compassion there, even though, like you, that phrase tends to annoy me in no end. And I do remember a couple of times as a counselor, somebody using that to sort of push away the experience, saying, well, I'm sure there's a reason for this. And I said, yes, I'm sure there is too, but some of those reasons you're not going to like. Yeah, right. There are reasons. But if it means I'm sure there's a good reason, I'm sure there's a soothing and comforting reason. No, there may be a very uncomfortable reason this thing happened. There may be a flat out bad reason this thing happened. We have to make place for those too.
Okay, now that I was able to
work that one a little bit,
open up to you, Bill, and have you talk me down from the happened for a reason ledge. I'd like to talk about more things. So we've talked about journaling. We've talked about the beneficial use of reading novels, watching plays, and how those can be helpful for us cognitively, for ourselves, as well as even cognitively. It allows us to use our brains in creative ways, and that is good for our brain. So those are pluses. I'd like to touch on the benefit of exercise to the brain.
Yes.
And so that's partly because you're generating blood flow, and it's also the important key ingredient here from what I've read is that exercise releases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and that is sort of like miracle grow for the brain. It bathes neurons, allows the neurons to grow. It helps to increase the durability of neuroplasticity. And so that is if you needed an excuse to exercise and you have more appreciation for your brain than your body, then exercise for your brain and get that BDNF.
How do we do that, though? I mean, I don't have infinite time to exercise. Is there a more targeted way to go about that?
It's the same advice that they would have heard in our last episode on the physical self-care, and that's just 10 minutes of walking can be enough. And preferably that is a little bit more vigorous walk. We don't want it to just be your sauntering down the neighborhood, maybe a little effort to it, but 10 minutes has shown to have an effect. Mm-hmm. So it could just start there, simple, easy, and you're better off for it. The next thing, and I don't know if this is related, I'm reading a book about Robert Hartman. He was a psychologist in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Tennessee, New Mexico. He's from Germany originally, so he grew up in the era of Hitler. That's when he left Germany. And so he talked about recognizing that Hitler was evil, and it inspired him to look for ways for the good. So he became somebody that teaches the importance of values, and that as an avenue for us to do good. So to me, this is also cognitive. When we're doing a values assessment on ourselves, this is a cognitive part of us that is trying to interpret what it is we stand for. How do we want to live our lives? And so a values exercise and then living according to those values is a cognitive process that I think would be beneficial and helpful for us. So I wanted to put that out there to the cosmos and let you kind of either feed on that or add to that if you had anything.
Well, my immediate thought goes to, there are these wonderful, awful moments that we have sometimes when we begin to see our values clearly.
Did you say wonderful, awful?
Wonderful, awful. Yeah.
Wonderful, awful. Okay, I'm going to need some explanation on that.
I was looking for a word that would encompass both, but I'm not sure we've got that in English, so I just went for it. Where we begin to get clear on our values, the things we value, and we realize that our narrative works against that, or doesn't include them, or leads us away from them. That can be a very convicting moment. Clients I work with who are addicts and suddenly realize that the behavior, the living out of their narrative day to day regularly violates the values they have as a human being, and something's gotta change. On a lighter way, I think that happens to all of us before we make some crucial life changes. But without the value piece, there's no way to assess the narrative. You could have it like Hartman was talking about, the Nazi narrative of the 1930s and 40s was so powerful. It was easy for people to be swept up into that narrative unless you were very careful and very grounded in your own values that gave you a place to stand so you could assess the narrative. Otherwise, it's, well, everybody's thinking this and everybody's doing this, and it's what I'm hearing from every place, and it's on the radio, and so it's got to be right. And that's how we get our values shaped for us. I mean, our narrative shaped for us, because we don't regularly have our values to reflect on it.
Yeah, interesting. Do you have a preferred method or activity of core values self-assessment?
One of the ones I learned from Bob Fraser was the idea of the LifeMap, which is a little bit like our narrative, but it also has that history of events, but it also includes our actions and reactions to those, that I think tells us so much, particularly if we can get down to to the times when it just flowed out of us. The other exercise I really like, and I do this pretty regularly, is I call it your best day exercise. You remember that really best day you had, may have been last week or years ago or whatever, when everything seemed to flow and you felt both important in the world, and yet you sort of knew your place, that you weren't the center of the world. You felt effective. You felt creative. Well, what was going on? What were you doing? What were you thinking? What story did you have in your head? What dialogue did you have in your head about that led you into that place of flow, into that place of joy? Let's go back and dissect that a little bit. That was telling you something, that moment when things were good and right, and you had this fully human presence in the world. Something good was happening. Let's see if we can deconstruct that and figure out what all the pieces were.
So can that be done with a prospective best day description?
Like what would make the best day?
Yes.
I have tried that with clients. The problem there is that one becomes so overlaid with sort of what I'll call the cultural artifacts. The commercials I've seen of what I ought to own to have a good day, and the people I've talked to of what I ought to be doing, and my father said I should be a pro football player. I was like, so yeah, you can, but you can run into a lot of interference.
Yeah. Okay. So then I'd like to run through the LifeMap exercise. When we guide people on that, we tell them to draw their life in however descriptive form they would like. We call it a life map. That doesn't mean it has to be a map. It could be a circle, a square, a line that is chronological from 0 to however old you are, and along that line you draw events, however you want to create that. And we want you to describe the significant events in your life, is how I've done it. You can certainly give your additions to this once I'm done, Bill, based on what might be slightly different or how to interpret it differently. And once you've done that for your whole life, we often do it in a small group. And so we're reading it to each other as a icebreaker tool, as well as a values interpretation tool, so that people that are hearing it get to interpret what values were demonstrated when you read it and how you read it. I think it's much more difficult, kind of like interpreting your own narrative is difficult. I think it can be difficult to interpret our own life maps for values. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's just, I think that doing it with a significant other or an important person in your life or your counselor or whoever can be a valuable tool to help with interpretation of what values those events stand for, and how that might be then putting an impression on what your values are now and how you might be able to then live them going forward.
Oh, absolutely. I like that you included that it's best if it is witnessed. My mentor used to say that, so many of the really important moments in our lives, we have to go through alone and there is no witness. And there is something very healing to talk about those moments of struggle with a kind and non-judgmental witness, whether that's a group or a loved one or a counselor or whoever, but someone you can feel safe doing that with. Right there is, we are such social creatures, and to do that and have a witness can radically change that struggle into something that is a learning moment or even a moment of triumph. The other piece that I like to do sometimes, I have longer to work on people's life stories than you do in the strategic planning, where you're trying to move on to some other things. I can, in counseling, revisit them often. I also help people relabel moments.
Can you give an example?
Sure, I'll give a personal example I occasionally do in the EI workshop. As many people know, I have terrible dental phobia. So when I went in to have all 4 quadrants of my mouth rebuilt, that was a huge emotional moment, a real struggle, low point, a time of both fear and determination, and a lot of things had to come together. And I went through several appointments to do that. And at the end, I remember walking out on that last day. It was, that thing where it's just a check and everything's fine, and you're walking out. And I was stopped by, some of the team members. And they said, "We just want you to know you're our hero." And all of a sudden, this thing I thought was frightening, a struggle, but kind of like, why did this have to happen to me? I suddenly reinterpreted it as that was a heroic act.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did it make it not scary? No. Not painful? No. But I put it someplace different in my narrative. This wasn't that thing I had to do anymore. It is a way I proved myself. It's a way that I spoke my values into the world. It was something that I achieved. That's how I stored that heroic moment. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a triumph.
Great example. Thank you.
Just a relabel.
Mm-hmm.
But it helped to have witnesses with the relabel.
Well, it sounds like the witnesses were able to provide an alternative, a potential place for that. And even if you didn't accept fully that you were a hero, I mean, let's play even devil's advocate here, and you disagree with them in that, it still is going to change your perspective.
Yes.
Even if you don't want it to. we don't have that much power over what we think and how we think, that even somebody coming and saying, "Wow, you're a hero," is going to feel good and is going to be beneficial.
This is also a good time to talk about that rather pernicious cognitive piece that we have called self-talk, which shows up in psychology, particularly in counseling, is the kind of negative self-talk that we develop that keeps us ashamed of things. Oh, you should have done better. You should have done it sooner. How could you make that stupid mistake? And who do you think you are? And all those things that can be repeated over and over and over, like an inner dialogue, particularly when we do something wrong, particularly when we do something that runs afoul of our values. That might just be guilt, but that inner dialogue can change it into a source of shame. That, oh, we aren't worth anything. So the problem that we run into is, let's say at that moment, I had an inner dialogue that said, that I'm the victim here, and that this was a terrible, tragic thing that happened to me that I somehow did not deserve. And they said, "You're our hero." Now I've got cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is this weird discomfort that shows up in the human brain when we're trying to hold two opposite and competing ideas at the same time. We don't like doing that. Okay, that's just how we're built. It's I'm sure there's some Zen master that can do it, but most of the rest of us, it does not feel good, and we want to resolve that discomfort. Well, that we could resolve it either way. I resolved it that day as letting the heroic part push away the part that said, this is a victim, you ought to be angry at all this. You're a victim that ought to be angry at this. No, you're a hero and you have tried. Okay, but there was a real moment of cognitive dissonance. That is not easy to do. Many times through life, we get hit with something that contradicts our inner dialogue, and there's cognitive dissonance. And we struggle to change, to accept the new thing. And sometimes we shouldn't accept the new thing. Sometimes that cognitive dissonance is reminding us that, no, we had the right idea in the first place. So it's not as simple as just always go with what people tell you. But there are times that someone says, I care about you. I'm on your side. I love you. I'm loyal to you. And that darn little inner dialogue is saying, no, you're not. No, you're not. No, you're not. I am too worthless for anyone to actually feel that way about me. And now we got cognitive dissonance and we got to struggle. And it takes some courage and some determination to hang with it long enough and to hold both those things in our head and not resolve it the quick and easy way, which is always going to go in favor of the habitual and the self-talk. I mean, that's just, it's like, okay. And I know people like that. I'm sure you know people like that. They always default to the self-talk. They're those people that are really hard to buy a gift for because they're going to get embarrassed and not going to like whatever because it just causes too much cognitive dissonance when you show up with it. So, yeah, it's cognitive. It's not just emotional. It is a kind of narrative that says, no, this is what this means. One of the exercises I do with clients that I do with myself sometimes, and I really recommend, is sometimes I suggest people just let something in experimentally. What if I just let myself be a hero in this moment and see what it's like? What if I just let myself feel worth that compliment I just got from a colleague just right now? I don't have to change my whole life. Okay, I don't want to do battle mano a mano with my negative self-talk right now. How about just, I'll just for right now, just to see what it's like. Just experiment with it. What if I had a morning where I just didn't tell myself that I was a total screw up? Try to go through an hour, maybe a whole morning, maybe a whole day. And again, just experimentally, let's just see what happens with that new narrative. There's the idea, of course, if I can't run it, I was like, no. This is an experiment. It's a game. Let's just try it.
So that we're dipping our toes now in the world of critical thinking. And I think that spending a whole episode talking about critical thinking would be worthwhile. So I'm not going to go any further into it now, but that's the world of where cognitive dissonance comes from for me. Where I learned about it was learning about different critical thinking tools, knowledge, logical fallacies, cognitive biases, that kind of stuff. So it would be fun to talk about some of those at some point, and they would fit into this idea of cognitive health and cognitive self-care. To me, does mean that we spend some time to learn about critical thinking and learn about how we might not think critically in certain areas because of our narrative, because of our different biases and stuff like that. And cognitive dissonance is one of those that comes up. So I'm glad you brought it up. And I think that's really valuable. I like your tool there, your tip on what to do with that and how to experiment with that. And I think we should spend some time in that world with a full episode.
Oh, yes. Let's do that.
Then I'm going to come back to the self-talk. So I think that I agree with you on the power of negative self-talk and how intrusive that can be. And there is also now a problem of toxic positivity.
Yes.
Where everything is everything gets a positive spin put onto it. And I think both of those are not good for us and our cognitive health. And we should work to find the nice middle ground where if we are overly negative, your experiment is fantastic. Spend a day where that's not true and see what happens. But on the other end, that doesn't mean go through the day where everything is rainbows and unicorns, because that's also not real. That it's okay to have bad things happen within a day and the day still be good. And admitting those things, like admitting when we make a mistake, there's value in that versus saying, oh, that was supposed to happen because now I'm gonna get a new pair of shoes. I don't know. So that's my addendum to the negative self-talk is to also be careful with the positivity.
And I like stories, and I love to be a storyteller. And so I'm constantly reading some of the old traditional stories and some of the Greek myths and whatever, and particularly the Greeks, but other people too. You'll notice that the heroes always have to do hard things. Things always get bad at some point. So when there's too positive self-talk, what I frequently do for myself or other people say, wait a minute, but what are we missing? Because the positive self-talk colors over things and blots them out. It's like airbrushing your life. But some of those wrinkles and some of those rips are actually important and important experiences. I mean, I could over positive my life, but then I couldn't tell the stories of the hard things I've done. Especially those hard things that do seem unjust. And it wasn't like, oh, well, I'm sure that there's a reason. Like, well, what if I just acknowledge that we are built to do hard things and we need to do hard things? Not all the time. Life should not be miserable, but there are moments when we have to do hard things. And that's not a bug. That's a feature of being a human being.
Yeah. A few other things I have on my list to touch on in this area. These can go fast. Don't smoke. Smoking is bad for the brain. Don't be an alcoholic. Too much alcohol is bad for the brain. And now we have more research that indicates that binge drinking on weekends is also bad and for the brain as well as the body. And even more than 2 drinks a day. Some are even saying even 1 drink a day in certain individuals. That we're finding genetic markers now that are telling us that alcohol could be worse than we thought for some people. So avoid that if needed. And get good sleep. Poor sleep, if you haven't already noticed, impacts your ability to think clearly.
I'm going to add a piece, though.
Please do.
Not to disagree, but to add. If you're experiencing poor sleep, that's often a symptom of something wider that you need to take. This isn't a moment of shame. I should just learn how to do good sleep better. There's not really a procedure for this. You can't. It's not like practicing makes you a better sleeper or something. It is a symptom that something else is going on. One of the possibilities is that this sort of self-talk or this cognitive piece that is worrying or trying to figure out a threat is on hyperdrive. It's a little like, you've got the motor up to 3,000 RPM and you take the load off suddenly, like lying down and trying to sleep, and all of a sudden the engine is just going wild. It can be like that for people. They are dealing with difficult days. They're dealing with difficult self-talk about their day. They're dealing with a difficult and maybe shameful narrative of their day. And then they lie down. And, I've got clients say, I don't want to go to sleep. My head's a really bad neighborhood. I don't want to go in there. And so I keep myself up as long as possible, finding more things to do, because it's not going to feel good to lie down. So if that's happening, again, don't just try to blame yourself for not sleeping right. Go find out what's pushing you to make sleep not a good place to be.
Yeah. This too could be its whole episode. Sleep is so valuable, but I think that we've gone too far, and we're creating sleep hypochondriacs, and that's a problem, because sleep is important, but that doesn't mean that your life is ruined if you have a week of poor sleep. Yes. That's not great, but that's not the end of the world. To your point, the idea of ruminating is how I've read about what you described, where we lay down and we just keep going through everything that happened during the day. The things that are unfinished is my problem, where I know that there is somebody I have to talk to, or there's a project unfinished and I didn't get as much progress as I wanted today. And so the ideas just keep going and going and going and going. And so I'm going to come back to something you suggested earlier, and that's journaling. I've found that it's really helpful if I can get some of those ideas onto paper. It reduces the load on my brain, and sometimes it allows me to get to sleep. It doesn't always work, but sometimes that little thing helps a ton.
That also brings up the important piece that's cognitive, worrying.
Yes.
And a lot of people think of worrying as, I need to figure out what to do. I define worrying differently, and I approach it differently. Worrying is a sign that we're feeling helpless. Because what worry is continuing to throw ourselves against some wall, hoping it'll move. You're a bright guy. I'm a bright guy. Most of my clients are bright folks. If in 10 or 20 minutes they haven't figured out a plan to deal with something, they're probably helpless in that moment of, this may be something I can't fix. This may be something that I'll have to let happen before I have enough data to be able to approach it. I'll have to say this to that person and figure out how they react instead of trying to imagine all the possibilities and nail them down. It's like, so wait a minute, this is about helplessness. It's not planning. And it's not, if I just knew what to do, and one day if I worry enough, I'll come upon the magic. No, that's not what it's about. It's about addressing our own helplessness, some of which is just baked into the world. Okay. Some of it are ways we've made ourselves helpless. Like, well, I need to tell this person this thing, but I can't make them upset. I can't make them angry. It's like, well, wait a minute. With that piece in place, you've made yourself helpless. So it's like, if you're worrying, you may have made yourself helpless. The world just may be organized like that. Or the other thing that's going on is that you may be having a values conflict that you're avoiding, which is, no, I need to do this, but I don't want to do this. One possibility is saying, no, what values am I maybe violating here? And the worry and the helplessness is a wake-up call that says, oh, wait a minute, I'm up against one of my values here, or the way I'm acting is not working, or I'm dealing with a person and we have very conflicting values. So look in the values realm is a good place to go if you're worrying. It sounds like you ought to be planning, but the whole idea of worry is what you do when the planning doesn't work.
I have a quote for you that might fit here and kind of allows us to wrap this up over the next 5 to 10 minutes. Tell me what you think about this. This is from Bertrand Russell. If an opinion contrary to your own makes you angry, that is a sign that you are subconsciously aware of having no good reason for thinking as you do. If someone maintains that 2 and 2 are 5, or that Iceland is on the equator, you should feel pity rather than anger, unless you know so little of arithmetic or geography that his opinion shakes your own contrary conviction. The most savage controversies are those that matters as to which there is no good evidence either way. Persecution is used in theology, not in arithmetic, because in arithmetic there's knowledge, but in theology there's only opinion. So whenever you find yourself getting angry about a difference of opinion, be on your guard. You will probably find upon examination that your belief is going beyond what the evidence warrants.
Oh, I like that. I like that. That sense that your anger is actually functional in that moment. It's doing something. The other person isn't making you angry. You're angry as a tool, as a response. Your cognitive set is trying to fix something. Maybe it's a fear, like he was talking about. Maybe it's lack of knowledge, but it's not just this weird thing that happens. There's something going on.
Yes.
I'm going to also sound like a counselor for a minute. One of the big reasons why we often get angry at other people's opinions or thoughts is because there's a part of us that agrees with them.
Yeah, I've always heard it as that's probably something that we need to work on. Like there's something that is hitting personal, and rather than dealing with that difficult item, we get mad at it. We get mad at the other person. We get mad at their idea or their statement.
I was talking to a colleague the other day who was so mad at this younger counselor we both know. And I finally looked at her and said, oh, she's just like you when you were that age. I remember you. We go back a long way. It's like, no, you struggled with that. What you're seeing is that reminder of your history. And the mistakes you made and how painful that was, and that's unsettled you. You don't want to see it again. You don't want to watch that movie again. You saw it the first time and it was already uncomfortable.
Yep.
And now she's sort of making you see it a second time, and you're going, oh my gosh, I made those same mistakes. How could I have been so dumb? And you're angry at her. Not for her mistakes, but because she's making you watch that movie again.
Wow. With that, we should put the bow on the mental/cognitive self-care topic, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.